Audi or Howdy?
I would say rather Fiat or something like Fiat 500. I would like to thank Nadia and Tom and everyone else involved in organizing this really wonderful event. So the last 2 days have just been really, really wonderful, and I had, enjoyed so many nice presentations, met so many nice people. So I'm trying to kind of like charm you before my presentation. Maybe not so hard on me, but I'm going to talk about something that I refer to as new sacred geographies. I kind of made that term up because I kind of felt what I'm trying to accomplish here is something architectural, but on a much, much, much broader scale. So, characterized by the cultural sensibilities and social visions that formed the mass consciousness of the modern world, the 60s were synonymous with the expansion of existing realities in almost every aspect of human life. Everything is music, all is love, Allen Ginsberg's Everything is Holy, or Joseph Beuys' Everything is Art, expressed optimism and dynamism and dynamics in a time of cultural crisis. In his manifesto, Absolute Architecture, Austrian architect Hans Hollein criticized architecture, quote, as a ritualistic expression of pure elemental will and sublime purposelessness. In times of conformism and post-industrial crisis, he questioned if architecture had the capacity to extend the means of its own determination beyond built statements. In his proposal, Everything is Architecture, he eliminated any closures of defining architecture and removed all boundaries between architecture and other fields. He argued that the truth of everything is architecture and the process of redefinition and emergence of a new self-determinant. For thousands, so this is a little break here now, for thousands of years, the transformation of man's world with buildings as the essential manifestation of man contributed to an inapplicable sense of gravitas. Especially, sacred structures have been manifested in iconic sculptural objects as an expression of the consistent human desire to translate these forces into recognizable monuments. In the aftermath of World War II, mass consumerism characterized the American society and influenced the political economy and national identity of Americans, determining how they made a living, where they dwelled, and what they consumed. In the past, values took their character from the church. Post-war identity, however, was formed by business and consumption, defining a new sense of values, and tradition. These cultural changes continued to influence religious architecture that shifted its focus from iconic early 20th century churches for mass evangelism to more recognizable structures that blended with the post-war commercial landscape. In this paper, I aim to examine how evangelist Robert Schuller challenged the public perception of Protestantism in the United States, and with the ambition to define new horizons in evangelism, he developed formal repertoires that looked beyond institutional frameworks and embraced the world as a possible scale of operation. In times of decentralized culture and deregulated religious ecologies, Schuller's vision was to embellish architecture in mass media and mass consumerism. His philosophy of retailing religion served as his guiding principle and merged mass consumerism and religion with the ambition to expand the perception of his church. In the 19th century, revivalist preachers like George Whitefield went out of institutional frameworks to preach the word where it was needed. When people wouldn't come to church, then the church would have to come to people. Schuller, however, blurred these boundaries with his church. His understanding of sacred space was suggested if religion could be retailing, it potentially could be everywhere and everything without being bound to institutional frameworks. While some critics insist that the commercial aesthetic of post-war churches are sites of disappearance and of meaning, his sense for translating the cultural geography into sacred spaces suggested that the boundless revitalization of his church gained public presence through the disappearance of meaning and representation. His idea of expanding the religious image not only overcame traditional meanings of sacred architecture, but also the traditional dichotomy of form and function, suspending it as a critical instrument between autonomy and total immersion. Inspired by the 19th century revivalism and modern visions that were obsessed with mobility and its culture, Robert Schuller imagined a sacred space without compromising the moral objectives of revivalism. Unlike the 18th and 19th century revivalists who relied for spiritual renewal and change of mindset upon the defamiliarization of the emerging urban population in the wilderness, Schuller wanted to familiarize the seeker using the car, television, and other modern commodities and bring them into a religious context as part of an immersive evangelical experience. Where others held on to traditional Main Street church models, he found purpose in the ramifications of rapid urbanization and all other societal conditions that came with the cultural shifts after the war. Though he advocated valuing the divine order over the existing capitalist order, he did not reject commercial aesthetics that came with it. Actually, he employed the rapidly growing mobile society and fused it as an integrated extension of his church and a new sacred order. His endeavor began in 1955 when he arrived in Southern California. He came from Illinois, where he in only 5 years grew a church from 35 members into a congregation over 500. With this success, but no money in his pockets, Schuller moved to Orange County, where he saw the opportunity to establish a new Reformed church. He coincidentally found a drive-in movie theater vacant on Sunday mornings that served his purposes of Reformation. That's the theater. He rented the place and preached rain or shine from the concession stands of the theater. He delivered his message via the standard drive-in theater radio transmission that was attached to the cars. His drive-in service was so popular that he gained enough funds to build an actual church. However, the Sunday morning service at the drive-in theater became such an essential part of his practice that after an opening of his chapel, he continued preaching in both. In 1959, Schuller had the idea to merge the two and make his dream of a drive-in walk-in church a reality. In search of an architect that could build his vision, he found Richard Neutra, who perhaps was the only architect in California equal to his ambitions. He certainly was the most famous practitioner at the time and skilled enough to develop Schuller's complex vision. Neutra took on what seemed to be an impossible challenge. Despite the imminent contradictions between the modest traditions of Christianity and the image of a humble preacher that merged with that of a heroic movie star, the opening of the Garden Grove experiment in 1961 gave the Christian world a glimpse into the future of what was possible in modern sacred architecture. Transparent glass facades, vivid gardens with water features, and a car amphitheater were only the beginning of a new era. A few years later, in 1968, with the completion of the Tower of Hope, Neutra completed Schuller's important vertical symbol in the otherwise horizontal landscape of Orange County. The 90 feet tall structure with high-speed elevators and the first 24-hour telephone counseling center in America further emphasized his vision of new horizons in evangelizing the Southern California landscape. This is just like a little fun fact. Those were the tallest structures in Southern California, and one was the fake Matterhorn at Disneyland. Kind of ironic. His church in a tower, tallest structure in the region, transmitted a new image of Christ to the public and provided a visual pivot point that was characterized by a new sense of an intensified sensory perception of an expanded religious experience. Despite the modern interpretations of evangelical revivalism, Schuler understood that the ideological separation of urban and pastoral values created a breeding ground for new religious ideologies. In order to sustain the success of his church, he needed to position it right between the grounds on which political and religious campaigns battle for the attention of American families. The American home, a place where a man could display his success through the accumulation of new consumer goods, became the place in which morality and domesticity conflicted with secular lifestyles. Citizens who felt suffocated by the dream of the American paradise, lonely in their idealized homes or office cubicles, began to search for a new sense of purpose, which churches promised to provide. In spite of the ambition to move beyond ideology, Schuler nourished pastoral values, but fused them with culture and entertainment into something that could be characterized as the cult of the new, an irrational belief that new is always better. This cult, probably the most radical aspect of the post-war era, for better or worse, was in constant need to produce more and more new products and events. Schuler perfectioned his strategy and provided new consumer-oriented services with architecture as a framework that fully absorbed material culture with religion as a product. Moreover, he employed the American dream as a metaphor and placed the constantly self-renewing dream symbolically somewhere between the other and reality, a place between pastoral and urban values representing a symbolic location that developed a direct or inverse analogy to real space of society. The reciprocity of the economic and symbolical political systems in the 1960s challenged evangelical churches to act within all types of frameworks, large and small, traditional or progressive. The growth of evangelical Christianity represented a rejection of liberal secular pragmatism and contributed to a revival that countered the materialism of consumerism with a search for authenticity and meaning. I could slow it down, I think I'm good in time. The emergent evangelical middle class struggled with a dichotomy between values and value systems in newly built suburban environments that otherwise were characterized by a lack of organically grown communities. In such environments, the shopping mall became a place that satisfied the need, what Liz Cohen refers to as citizen consumer. Shopping malls moved into the center of community life and became the nexus of public life that seamlessly integrated the spirits of post-war America. Robert Schuler saw the need to address these changing societal conditions and challenge the public perception of religious institutions to change direction and address the decentralized culture and subsequently a deregulated religious ecology. Fearing that the church would further detach itself from the world and become culturally marginalized and institutionally fragmented, Schuler envisioned a prosperously growing institution that was vital and big across the United States. He claimed that the traditionalist leaders were tragically missing the connection of successfully early 20th century church growth. He even argued, and I quote, "Much as it may offend many leaders in the church, in the Christian church, the truth remains that the parish church is in the business of retailing religion." End of quote. He seized upon the idea of retailing as a new motive for an expanded religious service and an architecture that would package goods and service for the consumer. By emphasizing physical characteristics such as accessibility and location, Schuler recognized the fact that churches, like businesses, needed easy access and a flow of people. His analysis of traditional churches and Main Street churches found that these models violated the fundamental principle of successful retailing. In his pamphlet, "Your Church Has Real Possibilities," he explained that one of the major criteria of a successful church is surplus parking, as we can see. With the development of shopping centers, Americans had become used to the convenience of easy parking. But a look at reality gave evidence that parking wasn't always easy for churchgoers at super churches. In his church, parking was staged and a very important part of his religious practice and the larger architectural ensemble. Parking became such an integral part of his philosophy that it became an extension of his church and his practice. Time is, and I quote him again, time is too valuable to waste making a trip only to find they don't have the goods. Consumers will go where the business has the reputation for having a wide inventory range and parking. His understanding of the quotidian translated into his service and architecture, in which the divine became an integrated extension of the real world. In a conversation with Schuler, Neutra asked, why did the churches ever get into the custom of building structures that obstruct from their view of the outside secular world, end of quote. Schuler supposed it would come from the concept that God is in the sanctuary or in and around the altar. Neutra felt enlightened by Schuler's response, but Christians sought fellowship with Jesus on the mountaintop, in the outdoors. They had experience with Christ under the open sky and in the sanctuary and on the beach. Neutra then proceeded to answer his own question. In the early days, the Christians were forced underground, and in the dark underground caverns, candles were required to give light. Consequently, little children were raised to have religious experiences in a setting where the world was shut out and only candles flickered. So when the Christian children became adults and finally emerged in the sunlight, they designed the structures that would recreate what is in their minds and in a sort of a religious mood. Hundreds of thousands of churches are designed to stimulate not the positive emotions of joy and hope that come with the fall of the sunlight in the room. Rather, they are designed to stimulate the negative emotions of darkness, dreariness, and gloom. Schuler felt painfully sorry for pastors who tried to impress modern Americans with churches based on traditional models. He claimed, churches like this, quote, churches like this announce to one and all, this church is old-fashioned, out of date, and from past generations without any exciting plans for the future. Schuler believed that the evolution of the soul belonged to a larger whole and was more significant and beautiful when integrated with the secular world. I think that's very important. With this vision of the church, she imagined places in which the secular and the sacred could coincide in a new religious experience. His architect's proposal offered a therapeutic resolution for what Sylvia Levin described as a pathological psychology of ecclesiastic, I knew that, I cannot say that word, architecture, yes, thank you. Although originally motivated by economic need and convenience, his story and the coincidence that merged a church and a drive-in theater ended up transforming the traditional nature of evangelical churches, if not all. The increasing popularity of this new form of religious service was part of a strategy to establish characteristic images for his church that were properly suited to the urban landscape and a modern imagination. His idea created superb, as he calls it, architecture not only sought to change the church's imaginative and visionary image, but also attempted to evoke honesty through a universal architectural expression that, so Schuler says, hopefully becomes inconspicuous and nature becomes the center of attention. And so one is impressed with the sky, the water, the flowers, the trees, and the green grass, all of it, which means the structure becomes the vehicle for effective communication. When the large glass sliding doors of his church opened during the Sunday service, so basically the facade here opened up so that he could kind of preach to the outside and the inside at the same time. The act of stepping outside transformed the service into an event in which the automobile became an active participant in a religious service inside of the church. 2 minutes. 2 minutes? Let me jump to a couple of conclusions then. Maybe just go through a couple of slides. This is just a sketch from Richard Neuter, how he imagined worshippers in the car. This is an analogy between Schuller and a revivalist preacher in the 19th century, where I feel like reaching out to the sky and kind of like blurring the horizon, kind of making the horizon more accessible to everyone. We can see that in revivalism. Kind of dorky today, actually. So in conclusion, sacred architecture has undergone various significant transformations in the past century. For some, the 20th century brought about the triumph of secularization over many aspects of material culture, and for others, the secular, rational, and politicized contributed to a new misunderstanding of sacred architecture. The resurgence of the questioning of the religious at a global scale is crucial in that it provides the backdrop to uncovering the critical importance of religious thought on urban and architectural theory that existed despite the secularization impulse of modernity. The common understanding of modern sacred architecture was defined by its metaphysical value, which in false conclusion was determined by the strict adherence to achieve a mystical and poetic dimension. The reciprocity of the mystical and the poetic, economic, commercial, and political systems challenged churches to act within all types of frameworks. After the war, the emergent evangelical middle class asserted their sense of values and tradition in newly built suburban environments. Within these environments, Schuller's architecture provided a framework for reclaiming the sacred that appeared to be lost to traditional models. 20 words left? I have to choose. Which 20 words I'm going to use. The last 20. The infinite production of new images and means of representation that reflected changing cultural paradigms endangered 21 new processes of redefinition and emergence of the new self, and a medium of expression expanded the field. Schuller's vision of spatial mobility generated a new topological diffusion which multiplied connections across the larger cultural landscape. I was just